The scariest part about comfort is that you usually don't notice it destroying you until your mind can no longer tolerate difficulty. Most people already feel this happening. They feel it at night, in the silence, in the strange exhaustion that appears even after an easy day. You sit down to focus for 10 minutes, and suddenly your hand reaches for your phone automatically, not because you're lazy, because your mind has been trained to escape discomfort before it can even fully appear. And after enough repetition, that reaction starts becoming your personality. You keep telling yourself you'll change. But every time life becomes uncertain, uncomfortable, emotionally demanding, your brain quietly pulls you back toward what feels safe. Scrolling, avoiding, delaying, distracting yourself. And every time you do it, your brain starts learning something dangerous. That's the trap. The human mind quickly becomes addicted to whatever removes tension fastest. Not what builds resilience, what feels easy, predictable, emotionally safe. And after years of living this way, something inside people starts weakening. Difficulty begins feeling heavier than it should. Stillness starts feeling uncomfortable. Even small responsibilities begin creating mental resistance. People can no longer sit quietly without stimulation. They can no longer think deeply without distraction. They can no longer tolerate boredom without reaching for dopamine. And the terrifying part, most people think this is normal adulthood now. Constant scrolling, constant noise, constant emotional exhaustion. Modern comfort is not relaxing people. It is sedating them, quietly, because destruction rarely arrives all at once. Sometimes it happens one small decision at a time, one avoided conversation, one delayed responsibility, one night spent escaping into stimulation instead of confronting yourself honestly, until, eventually, the person you could have become starts disappearing underneath emotional convenience. Not because you lack ambition, but because the brain naturally protects familiarity, even when that familiarity is destroying your confidence. And after enough repetition, something worse begins happening internally. You stop trusting yourself to handle discomfort at all. Silence feels unbearable. Uncertainty starts feeling threatening. Your attention becomes weaker. Your emotional tolerance shrinks, so the mind searches for relief constantly. More scrolling, more stimulation, more distraction. Anything to avoid sitting face to face with yourself. And the modern world profits from this version of you. Algorithms reward distraction. Convenience culture rewards avoidance. Everything becomes designed to keep your mind entertained long enough to stop questioning the life slowly shrinking around you. Because a person addicted to comfort becomes easier to control, and eventually even freedom itself starts feeling uncomfortable. That's when the mind stops being a tool and quietly becomes the cage. The dangerous thing about the comfort zone is that it rarely feels dangerous while you're inside it. That's why people stay there for years, because nothing dramatic happens at first. Your life still looks normal. You still go to work, still laugh with people, still tell yourself you have time to change. But slowly, something inside you starts shrinking. Not your intelligence, your willingness to face discomfort. You begin avoiding things without fully noticing it. Difficult conversations, uncertain opportunities, situations where rejection, failure, or embarrassment become possible. And at first, those decisions feel harmless. I'll start next week. I'm just mentally tired. This isn't the right time. But the brain remembers every avoidance, because every action teaches your mind something about who you are. And when avoidance becomes repeated, your identity quietly starts adapting around it. That's how people slowly become smaller versions of themselves, not through catastrophe, through repetition. You stop speaking honestly, stop taking risks, stop putting yourself in uncomfortable situations. And eventually, your entire life becomes organized around emotional safety. And the terrifying part? You can live this way for years without realizing your personality is changing. That's what makes comfort so dangerous. It destroys ambition quietly. Not loudly. You don't wake up one day completely broken. You just slowly stop becoming the person you could have been. And deep down, most people feel this happening. They remember there was once a version of themselves that wanted more discipline, more courage, more meaning, more life. But over time, constant convenience teaches the brain to prioritize relief instead of growth. So instead of building resilience, people build avoidance patterns. You can see it everywhere now. Someone opens social media without thinking. The second silence appears. Someone checks notifications during difficult work every few minutes. Someone turns on constant background noise because being alone with their thoughts feels uncomfortable. And after enough repetition, the brain starts confusing comfort with peace. But they are not the same thing. Peace comes from strength. Comfort comes from avoidance. One builds emotional stability. The other quietly weakens your ability to handle ordinary life. That's why small discomforts now feel strangely overwhelming for so many people. A difficult conversation feels mentally exhausting. Silence feels heavy. Uncertainty feels threatening. Even simple responsibilities begin creating emotional resistance. Because when the mind constantly escapes discomfort, its tolerance for reality starts shrinking. And eventually, a person becomes trapped inside patterns they can no longer clearly recognize. Avoid discomfort, feel temporary relief, lose self-respect quietly. Repeat that cycle slowly rewires the personality itself. And after years of living this way, something even more dangerous begins happening. The person stops believing they are capable of changing at all, not because change is impossible. Because the mind has rehearsed avoidance for so long, that surrender starts feeling natural. And most people never realize they surrendered until years of their life are already gone. The human mind does not care whether a pattern is destroying you. It only cares whether the pattern is familiar. That's what makes repeated comfort so dangerous. Because eventually, the brain stops seeing avoidance as a temporary reaction. It starts seeing it as identity. At first, people still notice the conflict. They still feel guilty after wasting hours distracting themselves. Still feel frustrated after breaking promises to themselves. Still feel the quiet disappointment that appears after another day spent avoiding what they know they should confront. But after enough repetition, even that awareness starts fading. And that's where the real damage begins. Because once the mind normalizes self-betrayal, a person can slowly disconnect from their own potential without fully realizing it. You start lowering standards to protect familiarity, telling yourself, "This is enough. I don't need that much. I'm fine staying where I am." Not because you truly believe it, but because ambition becomes painful when action disappears. A person can only ignore their own potential for so long before dreaming bigger starts feeling emotionally exhausting. So instead of confronting that discomfort, the mind quietly adapts downward. And over time, people begin restructuring their entire lives around avoiding internal resistance. Not growth, not meaning, relief. You can see it in small moments everywhere now. Someone opens the same apps repeatedly without even thinking. Someone stares at work for an hour but cannot begin. Someone lies in bed exhausted while their mind keeps searching for more stimulation. Even rest stops feeling like rest now. People sit in silence for a few seconds, then immediately reach for noise again. Music, scrolling, videos, notifications. Anything to avoid being alone long enough to notice what their habits are slowly turning them into. And the terrifying part, most people think this is just normal modern life. But it isn't normal. It's dependency. The brain becomes so used to emotional escape that stillness itself starts feeling uncomfortable. Not because silence is painful, but because silence removes distraction. And distraction has become emotional protection. That's why so many people now struggle to trust themselves. They hesitate constantly, overthink simple decisions, abandon goals quietly, feel mentally exhausted by ordinary responsibilities, not because they are incapable, because the mind has been conditioned to prioritize emotional comfort over psychological resilience. And eventually, the most dangerous shift begins happening. A person stops seeing their habits as choices. They start seeing them as who they are. I'm just not disciplined. I've always been this way. This is probably just my personality. But most personalities are not formed consciously. They are repeated. Repeated escapes. Repeated emotional patterns rehearsed so many times they start feeling permanent. That is how comfort quietly rewires identity. Not instantly, but slowly enough that most people never notice it happening until they no longer recognize the person they could have become. Most people think the cost of comfort is obvious. Weight gain, missed opportunities, procrastination, a lack of discipline. But those are only the visible symptoms. The real cost is much harder to see, because comfort rarely takes things away all at once. It takes them slowly, quietly, almost invisibly, until one day you look at your life and realize something important is missing. Not because it disappeared overnight, because it was gradually traded away for convenience. The first thing comfort takes is courage. Not dramatic courage, everyday courage. The courage to have difficult conversations. The courage to risk failure. The courage to speak honestly. The courage to step into uncertainty without knowing the outcome. Every time discomfort appears and you retreat, the mind learns a lesson, not that the situation was dangerous, but that avoiding it was necessary. Over time, challenges begin feeling larger than they really are. Situations that once felt manageable start creating hesitation. The world has not changed, but your relationship with difficulty has. And slowly, courage begins to disappear. The second thing comfort takes is confidence. Most people believe confidence comes from positive thinking. It doesn't. Confidence comes from evidence. From repeatedly proving to yourself that you can handle discomfort and survive uncertainty. Every difficult action completed becomes a message. I can trust myself. But when avoidance becomes the default response, those messages stop arriving. Instead, a different message starts repeating. I can't handle this. I'll do it later. Maybe I'm not ready. Eventually, the mind begins believing those stories, not because they are true, because they have been rehearsed so many times. And once confidence weakens, possibility begins shrinking with it. Comfort does not simply limit behavior, it limits possibility. People stop aiming for what they truly want. Goals become smaller. Expectations become lower. Excuses become more believable. Not because they lack ability, because they no longer trust themselves enough to act. And then something even deeper begins eroding. Self-respect. Because self-respect is built when actions remain loyal to values, and destroyed when actions repeatedly betray them. The mind remembers every promise you break, every excuse you justify, every moment you choose temporary relief over necessary growth. At first, those moments seem insignificant. A task postponed, a difficult conversation avoided, a commitment delayed, a promise to start next Monday. Then next Monday becomes next month. Next month becomes next year. And one day you realize years have passed while you were waiting to feel ready. That is how comfort steals time. Not dramatically, silently. A person can spend years protecting themselves from discomfort without realizing they are also protecting themselves from growth. And eventually something strange happens. They wake up feeling disconnected from themselves, not because they hate who they are, but because they remember who they could have been. That is the hidden grief comfort creates, not failure. Lost possibility, lost courage, lost trust, lost years, because failure at least means you tried. Failure leaves lessons, experience, but avoidance leaves questions. Questions that become heavier with age. What could I have become? What opportunities did I abandon? How much of my life was spent waiting? And that is why comfort is so dangerous. Not because it hurts immediately, but because it is patient. It waits. Year after year, slowly lowering standards, slowly weakening self-trust, slowly convincing a person that safety is enough, until one day they look back and realize the greatest loss was never success. It was the version of themselves they never allowed to exist. And if comfort can quietly take courage, confidence, possibility, self-respect, and years of a person's life, then the question becomes far more uncomfortable. What would your life look like today if you had never been taught to fear discomfort? By now, a difficult truth should be impossible to ignore. The problem was never comfort itself. The problem was dependence. Because comfort is not dangerous when you control it. It becomes dangerous when it begins controlling you. The moment your peace depends on easy conditions, predictable outcomes, and the absence of discomfort, your freedom quietly disappears. And that is exactly where most people find themselves. Not trapped by life. Trapped by the belief that they need life to feel comfortable before they can move forward. But something important happens when a person finally sees the trap. For the first time, they stop blaming themselves and start understanding what has actually been happening. Because the same mind that learned avoidance can learn courage. The same mind that learned dependence can learn resilience. The same person who spent years retreating from discomfort can begin moving toward it again. Not overnight, but sooner than they think. Because transformation rarely begins with a dramatic breakthrough. It begins with a moment, a very small moment. A moment most people would overlook. Imagine someone sitting alone late at night. The same person who has spent months postponing a decision, avoiding a conversation, delaying a goal, telling themselves they will start tomorrow, and for the first time, they do the thing anyway. Not because they feel motivated, not because fear disappears, not because confidence suddenly arrives. They do it while still uncomfortable. And something changes, not in the world, inside themselves. Because that single action sends a message the mind has not heard in years. I can trust myself. That is how strength returns, not through motivation, through evidence. Every time you face something uncomfortable instead of escaping it, you collect evidence. Evidence that you can handle uncertainty. Evidence that discomfort is survivable. Evidence that fear does not deserve authority over your life. And slowly, the identity that comfort weakened begins rebuilding itself. This is where most people get transformation completely wrong. They think confidence comes first, then action. But the truth is the opposite. Action comes first. Confidence follows. The person who appears fearless was not born that way. They simply accumulated proof. Proof that they could survive difficult conversations, difficult decisions, rejection, failure, uncertainty, while others spent years avoiding those experiences. That is why resilience feels so powerful. It is not the absence of fear. It is trust in your ability to face fear. And trust is built exactly the same way it was lost. Through repetition, not through one perfect day, not through one motivational video, through small acts of courage repeated consistently. One uncomfortable conversation, one difficult decision, one promise kept, one moment where you refuse to abandon yourself. Again, and again, and again. Because the comfort zone did not shrink your life all at once. It happened through thousands of small retreats. And freedom returns through thousands of small acts of courage. The beautiful thing is that life does not require perfection. It only requires willingness. A willingness to stop running. A willingness to face reality. A willingness to sit with discomfort long enough to discover it cannot destroy you. In fact, something surprising begins happening. The things you once feared start losing their power. The conversation becomes easier. The challenge becomes manageable. The uncertainty becomes familiar. Not because life changed, because you changed. Because every time you voluntarily stepped toward difficulty, you became slightly stronger than the person who stepped away from it yesterday, and eventually you realize something extraordinary. The thing you spent years searching for inside comfort was never comfort at all. It was strength. It was self-trust. It was the confidence that comes from knowing you can face reality without running from it. And once you discover that, comfort loses its control over you. Because life will always contain uncertainty. Life will always contain moments that test you. The question is not whether those moments will arrive. The question is who they will arrive to. A person conditioned by avoidance, or a person strengthened by challenge. Because one day, everyone is forced to face discomfort, but not everyone arrives prepared. And the people who spent years building resilience discover something most never understand. The path they spent years avoiding was the path that would have set them free. So before you leave this video, ask yourself one question. If comfort has shaped the person you are today, what might happen if courage shaped the next 5 years of your life? Because the greatest tragedy is not struggling. The greatest tragedy is spending your life becoming smaller to avoid the struggle. And the moment you stop running from discomfort, you stop surrendering your potential. You begin becoming the person you were always capable of being. Maybe the most dangerous thing about comfort was never what it took from you. Maybe it was what it convinced you to believe. Because after enough years of avoiding discomfort, a person begins accepting limits that were never real. They stop applying, stop trying, stop speaking, stop risking. Not because they cannot, but because they have repeated the same story for so long that it starts feeling true. I'm not confident enough. I'm not disciplined enough. I'm not capable of more. And eventually, they stop questioning those beliefs. They start building their lives around them. But there is something most people never realize. The mind treats repetition as truth. It does not ask whether a pattern serves you. It only asks whether the pattern is familiar. That means many of the limits people carry through life were never discovered. They were practiced. Practiced through hesitation. Practiced through years of choosing temporary relief over growth. And if a belief can be practiced, it can be unpracticed. It can be unpracticed. If comfort can condition a mind, then courage can condition one too. That changes everything. Because it means your future is not trapped inside your past. It means the person you are becoming is still being shaped, right now, by the choices you make when discomfort appears. Not extraordinary choices, ordinary ones. The decision to speak when silence feels safer. The decision to begin before you feel ready. The decision to keep a promise to yourself when nobody else is watching. That is where transformation begins. Not in dramatic moments, in ordinary moments repeated consistently. And perhaps that is the most hopeful truth of all. You do not need a different life to become stronger. You do not need perfect circumstances. You do not need certainty. You only need the willingness to stop surrendering to the part of yourself that wants to remain small. Because every meaningful life requires courage. Not extraordinary courage. Everyday courage. The courage to move while doubt is still present. The courage to continue while fear still exists. The courage to choose growth when comfort offers an easier path. And eventually something remarkable happens. The comfort zone that once felt like protection begins looking like a prison. The challenges you once feared begin looking like invitations. And the person you thought you were begins giving way to the person you could become. Years from now, you will look back on this period of your life. The question is, will you remember it as the time you continued choosing comfort, or the moment you finally stopped allowing comfort to choose for you? Because maybe you were never stuck. Maybe you were conditioned, and if that is true, then the limits you believe about yourself may not be your identity at all. They may simply be the result of what you have practiced. So the real question is no longer, who am I? The real question is, what am I becoming? And for the first time in a long time, that answer is still yours to decide. Maybe the greatest tragedy isn't failure. Maybe it's spending years becoming comfortable with a life you were never meant to settle for. Because comfort never asks you to stop dreaming. It only asks you to wait a little longer, until one day, the life you wanted exists only in memory. So before you leave this video, ask yourself one question. What is one uncomfortable thing you've been avoiding that you already know needs to change? Because the future version of you is being shaped by that answer. And whether you become stronger or remain where you are, depends on what you choose when comfort calls again.